There is a number buried inside the administrative records of the 1890 United States Census. That is the approximate count of individuals catalogued across the 8 supplemental schedules that tracked what the federal government formerly called the defective, dependent, and delinquent classes, the institutionalized, the impoverished, the undermained residents of poorhouses, asylums, and state reform facilities across the country. These were not criminal records. These were population records. And unlike every previous American census, the 1890 schedules were never filed with county clerks. The original copies went directly to Washington. There were no duplicates. In March of 1896, 5 years before any fire, before any flood, before any act of God that later became the official explanation, the United States Department of the Interior issued an order, and those supplemental schedules were destroyed, not misplaced, destroyed by order. The number 48,290 does not appear in any official summary today. The people it once described have no trace in the federal record. The story most people know goes like this. In January of 1921, a fire broke out in the basement of the Department of Commerce building in Washington, D.C. The 1890 census records were stored there, and they burned. Tragic, accidental, irreplaceable. The story ends there, at the edge of a fire, with a shrug and a footnote. That is not the version the documents tell. What the records show, specifically, the research published in Prologue, the quarterly journal of the National Archives itself, in the spring of 1996, is that the destruction of the 1890 census was not a single event. It was a process that began in 1896 with a deliberate government order, continued through a fire whose origin was never officially determined, and concluded in 1934 when the Department of Commerce destroyed what remained of the water-damaged schedules without authorization from the geographer's office, according to a handwritten note found inside a Census Bureau file. 3 separate destruction events spanning 38 years. And the very first one happened in complete silence, with no fire, no emergency, and no public record of protest. But what the standard account leaves out is not merely the sequence. It is the question of what was being erased, who was doing the erasing, and which institution, operating in parallel, 2 miles from those burning basement shelves, was simultaneously collecting the physical remains of the same populations whose names were being removed from the paper record. Begin with what the census itself was designed to capture. The 1890 enumeration was the most detailed population document the United States had ever produced. For the first time, enumerators prepared a separate schedule for each family. It asked about race with a specificity that had never appeared before, distinguishing not merely black from white, but mulatto, quadroon, octoroon, Chinese, Japanese, and Indian. It tracked home ownership, mortgage status, the number of children born and how many were still living, immigration status, and years of residency. It was, in the most literal sense possible, a registry, a national accounting of who existed, where they lived, and what their lives looked like. It was also, uniquely among all American censuses before or since, the only one in which the original schedules were not distributed to county clerks for local safekeeping. Every previous census had sent copies outward into the states and territories where local governments maintained them. In 1890, for the first time, the originals went to Washington alone. There were no backups. The National Archives building would not be authorized for construction until 1926. Congress laid its cornerstone on February 22, 1933, one day after authorizing the destruction of the 1890 census papers. In March of 1896, before the main population schedules were touched, the Department of the Interior issued an order destroying the supplemental schedules for mortality, crime, pauperism, and the special classes. The document trail notes that these were badly damaged by fire, a fire no contemporary report describes in any detail, occurring in a separate event from the 1921 disaster, before there was any public reckoning with records preservation. The people enumerated in those schedules, the residents of poorhouses, asylums, reform schools, and institutions, were removed from the official count before the century had even turned. Then came 1981. On January 10th, a fire broke out in the basement of the Commerce Building at approximately 5 in the afternoon. Investigators from the Bureau of Standards were brought in. No cause was ever determined. Census Director Sam Rogers estimated 25% of the 1890 general population schedules destroyed, with 50% of the remainder damaged by water. The remaining material sat in a warehouse for over a decade, piled, deteriorating, consulted by no one. In December of 1932, the chief clerk of the Bureau of the Census sent the Librarian of Congress a list of documents scheduled for destruction. Item 22 on that list read, Schedules, Population, 1890, Original. The librarian identified nothing on the list as permanent. Congress authorized destruction on February 21, 1933. A scribbled note found later in a Census Bureau file states the records were destroyed by the Department of Commerce in 1934, not approved by the geographer. The second piece of evidence is not on paper. It is in storage. In Suitland, Maryland. In 1986, representatives of the Northern Cheyenne Nation arrived at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of Natural History. What they discovered inside the collections had never been publicly disclosed. Approximately 18,500 Native American human remains were warehoused in the facility. By 1989, when the Smithsonian was finally pressured into a formal acknowledgement, the total figure for human remains in its collection stood at approximately 35,000. These were not artifacts, these were people. Catalogued, numbered, stored on shelves. The third piece of evidence is a government document. On September 1, 1868, the Assistant Surgeon General of the United States Army issued an order, recorded today in the National Archives' own catalogue of the Army Medical Museum collection, directing military medical officers stationed in what the order called Indian Country to collect crania for delivery to the Army Medical Museum. The order was systematic. The collection it initiated eventually yielded more than 4,000 Native American skulls gathered from battlefields, burial scaffolds, graves, and ossuaries. In later decades, that collection was donated to the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, where it was absorbed into the general holdings alongside remains collected through other channels. The fourth piece of evidence requires no interpretation. In 2023, a year-long investigation by the Washington Post established that the Smithsonian currently holds 255 human brains in a climate-controlled storage facility in Maryland. The record suggests that only 4 of those brains were collected with the consent of the individuals or their families. The collection was built primarily in the early 20th century under Ailes Herdlicker, the Smithsonian's head curator of physical anthropology, who believed and published the belief in scientific journals that white Europeans occupied the highest position in a racial hierarchy he was constructing through comparative cranial measurement. The populations most heavily represented in that brain collection are black and indigenous Americans. The Post was not permitted to enter the facility where the collection is stored. The fifth piece of evidence concerns 250,000 children. Between 1854 and 1929, a span that runs directly through the years when the 1890 census was being collected, damaged, warehoused, and ultimately destroyed, the Children's Aid Society operated what became known as the Orphan Train Movement. More than 250,000 children, most from the immigrant and working-class populations of eastern cities, were transported by rail to families across the Midwest and South. As Christina Baker Klein, whose research is lodged at the Orphan Train Heritage Society of America, has documented, record-keeping across this program was, in her words, spotty. Many children carried no birth certificates, no documented family names, and no verified origin. The placements were made without formal legal adoption proceedings in many cases. There is no complete accounting of what happened to all of them. The question that comes first is procedural. Why was 1890 the only census in American history in which the originals were not filed locally? Every census before it, going back to 1790, had distributed copies to county clerks, to state repositories, to local archives. That distributed system had protected the records against exactly the kind of centralized loss that occurred. Someone made the decision to centralize the 1890 records in Washington. That decision was made before anyone could have predicted a fire. Before anyone could have known there would be no National Archives building for another 36 years. The records of who made that decision and why do not appear to have been preserved. The second question is about timing. The supplemental schedules, the ones tracking institutionalized Americans, pauperism, special classes, were first destroyed in 1896, 5 years before the 1921 fire. These were precisely the records that documented the most invisible populations. Their destruction was ordered, not accidental. No official explanation has addressed why those schedules specifically were selected for the first round of removal. The third question is about the Smithsonian's legal status. When the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act was passed in 1990, requiring museums and federal institutions to return native remains and cultural objects to their tribes, the Smithsonian was explicitly exempted. The exemption was written directly into the legislation. A separate law, the National Museum of the American Indian Act of 1989, had already established the terms of the Smithsonian's engagement with its native collections, and those terms did not require compliance with NAGPRA's consent and repatriation standards. The question is not whether this was accidental. The question is what it means that the institution holding the largest collection of human remains in the United States is the same institution the law chose not to regulate. But the question that kept coming back was not about the fire or the exemption or the supplemental schedules. It was this: if the 1890 census was the most detailed population document ever produced in the United States, the closest thing to a national registry that had ever existed, and if that registry was destroyed across 3 separate events over 38 years, what exactly was being protected by its absence? One institution losing records is an administrative failure. 2 institutions operating in parallel, one removing names from paper, one collecting bodies from the field, is something that requires examination. 3 institutions doing it simultaneously, targeting the same populations within the same 30-year window, becomes something the evidence will not permit you to dismiss as coincidence. The pattern is this. Between roughly 1868 and 1896, 3 distinct systems were operating in American institutional life. The Army Medical Museum was collecting the physical remains of Native Americans through an official government directive. The 1890 census was creating an unprecedented, centralized, non-duplicated registry of the entire American population, including its most marginalized members, with no local backup copies. And the Children's Aid Society was moving 250,000 poor and immigrant children across the country in a system that generated no reliable tracking records. All 3 operations produced the same outcome. Populations that had existed were, in the documentary record, made harder to find, harder to count, and harder to prove had ever been there at all. The pattern reproduces itself in the aftermath. After the 1896 destruction of the special class schedules, no one resigned. After the 1921 fire, no cause was determined and no accountability followed. After the 1933 congressional authorization and the 1934 Commerce Department destruction of the remaining census schedules, archivists noted the absence of the fervent preservationist voices that had fought so hard in 1981. They had, in the words of the National Archives' own prologue publication, gone silent, and the document trail does not explain why. After 1990, when NAGPRA passed, the Smithsonian was exempted. After 2023, when the Washington Post spent a year investigating the brain collection, reporters were refused entry to the storage facility in Maryland. 1 instance is an anomaly. 2 instances are a coincidence. 3 instances, across different decades, different agencies, different stated purposes, become something else entirely. The pattern is the systematic removal of evidence that specific populations existed, in specific numbers, in specific places, at a specific moment in American history. The populations most consistently targeted by this removal are the same ones least able to advocate for their own documentation. Everything you have seen in the first half of this investigation is not background, it is the mechanism. I am not claiming that a single coordinated conspiracy erased the 1890 census and the Smithsonian's collection records and the orphan train files simultaneously. I am describing something more specific. What I went in expecting to find was a story about bureaucratic negligence, about records that fell through the cracks of an underfunded, pre-archival federal system. I did not find that. What I found instead was a pattern of active institutional decisions, each one documented, each one attributable to a named authority, that consistently moved in the same direction, against the same populations, with the same result. The Smithsonian Institution was established by an Act of Congress on August 10, 1846. Its founding charter vested governance in a board of regents composed of the Vice President of the United States, the Chief Justice, 3 members of the Senate, and 3 members of the House. From its earliest years, the Smithsonian's Bureau of American Ethnology, established under John Wesley Powell in 1879, was the primary federal institution tasked with systematically documenting and collecting material relating to Native American populations. That same bureau operated as a scientific arm of the same federal government that was, through the Army Medical Museum Directive of 1867, ordering the physical collection of native crania from battlefield sites. These are not my documents. They are theirs, written by the people who did the collecting, preserved in their own handwriting, catalogued in the Smithsonian's own archives, and in the records of the National Archives in Record Group 94. Alice Herdlicka, the Smithsonian's head curator of physical anthropology, built his collection of 255 human brains primarily between 1903 and 1941. The Washington Post's 2023 investigation established that the overwhelming majority of those brains were removed from black and indigenous individuals at or shortly after death, in hospitals, in prisons, in institutions, and that records suggest only 4 were collected with anything resembling consent. Herdlicka published his racial hierarchy theories in peer-reviewed scientific journals. He received institutional support, travel funding, and the explicit backing of the Smithsonian for these expeditions. He was not a rogue actor. He was the curator. The human cost of what was removed is specific. It is about a Northern Cheyenne family in 1986 learning that their ancestor's skull had been sitting numbered on a shelf in Washington for over 100 years. It is a genealogist in the 1990s discovering that an ancestor who should appear in the 1890 census simply does not exist in the record, not because they did not live, but because the year they lived in has been destroyed, authorized, and scrawled off by a handwritten note that was not approved by the geographer. It is a descendant of the orphan trains who cannot find their great-great-grandparents' birth name because there was never a legal requirement to write it down. The cold, specific feeling of this is not outrage at a historical wrong since corrected. The Smithsonian is still exempt from NAGPRA. The Museum Support Center in Suitland, Maryland still exists. The Post still has not been allowed inside. What gets counted gets protected. What gets named gets remembered. This is not a philosophical abstraction. It is the operating logic of every bureaucratic system ever built. The census exists to allocate resources, congressional seats, federal funding, legal personhood. The registry exists so that when someone is missing, there is a baseline to measure their absence against. The 1890 census was the most precise instrument the United States had ever developed for answering the question, who is here? It asked not merely whether you existed, but what race the state assigned you, whether your home was mortgaged, how many of your children had already died. For the populations it tracked with the most granular detail, indigenous peoples, black Americans, immigrants, the institutionalized, that precision was not neutral, it was potentially transformative. A complete, preserved 1890 census would have made it impossible to claim in any subsequent decade that those populations had not existed in the numbers and conditions the schedules recorded. I am not asking you to believe me. I am asking you to check. The National Archives' own prologue publication, written by an archivist, published in 1996, available online, describes the 1890 census as a genuine tragedy of records whose destruction was far more complex than the fire narrative suggests. It notes, with remarkable understatement, that the fervent voices who fought to save these records in 1921 had, by 1932, gone silent. It does not explain why. What we live with today, the gaps in genealogical records, the inability to verify family histories for certain populations, the absence of baseline documentation for the pre-20th century lives of millions of Americans, is not the residue of bad luck. It is the residue of specific decisions made by specific people inside specific institutions, documented in their own handwriting, and preserved in archives that most people will never visit. The past is not gone, it is organized. And the organization was done by the same institutions that are still operating today, still holding collections, still determining what the public is permitted to see. The Museum Support Center in Suitland, Maryland, is a 400,000 square foot facility operated by the Smithsonian Institution. It holds approximately 40 million objects and specimens across its climate-controlled storage bays, more than any of the Smithsonian's museums can display. It holds the brain collection. It holds the human remains. It holds the catalogues that describe what was acquired, from whom, under what authority, and in what condition. The 1990 National Museum of the American Indian Act, the legislation that exempted the Smithsonian from NAGPIRA, required the institution to inventory its native collections and consult with tribes. That process has been ongoing for 35 years. The Washington Post, after a year of reporting, was denied access to the storage facility where the brains are kept. The Smithsonian's own task force on human remains, reporting in 2023, acknowledged the dark history of the collection and called for new policies. The collection remains. 48 to 90 individuals were counted once, in 1890, in schedules designed specifically for them. The schedules were destroyed in 1896 by departmental order. There are no copies. Those individuals have no trace in the federal documentary record that survives today. The Museum Support Center still stands in Suitland. The catalogue of what it holds still exists. Nobody has fully answered what it was built to keep.